everyone. My name is Mike Douglas. I'm at the University of Hawaii. Most of my academic life has been spent studying East, Southeast Asia, and to a lesser extent, South Asia. So that's my focus. I want to begin by just stating what I think are some of the limitations of the SDGs. The main one is in the blue at the top of the slide. A report came out this year from the actually SDG group in New York, saying that fewer countries are actually monitoring the SDGs. Most will not be met of the goals, and many are reversing. Without drastic change, the world is heading toward a reversible tipping point. Democracy is in retreat, and there's no real participatory process that's actually engaged in this in a formal way. So I have so much to say today that I have to go very fast and I have to streamline what I'm saying. So I want to just focus on the built environment as it relates to the SDGs, because I think that might be of most interest to you. I will say this briefly. I was engaged in the New Urban Agenda with UN Habitat and the preliminary discussions in Surabaya a few years ago before the Keynote conference. It was a great group of people. We had wonderful rapport and good things to say, but we were told by UN New York that we could not add anything in terms of topics to the SDGs. So a lot of what we said was put on the side and did not reach prime time. Okay, so I'm talking about the Anthropocene. I'll get to that in a minute. These are the main points I'm going to make. The Anthropocene represents a new era of great instability in the world. We need to change our paradigm of how we view cities and the world and talk about long-term societal engagement rather than expert knowledge that guides us. Planetary urbanization, this is the urban century. Within a few decades, 60 to 80% of the whole world will be in cities. And when I say cities, I always mean city regions. So in the hinterlands will be rural areas as well. Disasters related to the crises of the Anthropocene occur in political space, which simply means whose voice is heard will determine what we do. And finally, if we want to get a resilience of cities, we have to democratize and decentralize political power. On the left hand of the screen, I define what I mean by resilience: recover, adapt, reduce exposure and vulnerabilities. And I'll be going through those. Let's first stopping point is I think there are really two competing paradigms of what is a city and what we think about when we think of cities. One is I call cosmopolis, or cosmopolitan, if you'd like. And it's the cities in which inhabitants can assert their differences and negotiate them in an affirmative way. It differs from the homogenizing global city, which I call globopolis. These two sides of the slide show you how different these perspectives are. The city as a theater of social action, which was the prevalent view of cities up to the late 20th century. It was gave precedence to people organizing the city over industries, markets, communication, traffic. As neoliberalism came to the fore in the 1980s, it began to overpower or to dominate any other discussion about cities. And suddenly we get the idea that the city is nothing more than a creator of wealth and engine of growth. And we have all these ideas of competitive cities, not cooperative cities, mind you, but competitive. So while corporations and governments are supposed to collaborate with public-private partnerships, cities are left to only compete. In this one article in the Economist, it says actually culture only accounts for 5%, and if you want to be a really great city, you have to have a Fortune 500 company located in your city. These are not trivial. These are very big difference in how we see what these are. And I'm arguing that we have to return to this kind of cosmopolis idea. This is another way of trying to express to you how I think that these differences in paradigms, globopolis versus cosmopolis, are actually quite profound and deep. And I don't have time to go through them. Maybe the last one is interesting for us. I don't mean to be pejorative about any kind of discipline or profession, but what I'm always arguing for is multidisciplinarity. I was at the National University of Singapore for several years, and we had conferences with more than 20 disciplines engaged in them, and they were really marvelous, and I hope that that can be the way of the future. I've asked the organizer of the conference to give each of you a PDF of this presentation so you can read and look more carefully, and maybe contact me later if you have more questions. Okay, the Anthropocene, the current geological age in which human activity has become the dominant influence on climate and the planetary biosphere. Some debate exists about when it started. Maybe it was the first fire in a cave a billion years ago, or whenever that was, or maybe it was the Industrial Revolution, and so on. But what I think is most salient is what's called the Great Acceleration, which starts really around 1950, post-World War II, and is not only carbon, but carbon turns out to be one of the greatest indicators of that. And that's when we really start to kill our planet in a very, very complex, multidimensional way. So here are some of the indicators of it. What I want to point out here is that climate change vulnerability is highest in East and Southeast Asia, parts of Africa. Environmental disasters are increasing in both frequency and impacts. And the greatest share of all environmental disasters that we actually track are in Asia. And so we need to pay attention that this is the most vulnerable region in the world to the impacts of the Anthropocene, not to disregard the Pacific Islands and other island nations. We are also moving toward what variously is identified as an irreversible tipping point at which there is no recovery that we can do as human beings. And that's a confluence of several different interactive processes that are shown in the map on the right. So in many ways, as I said in my introductory slide, the Anthropocene in history is passing the SDGs by. And while I think it's very worthwhile to focus on indicators that are presented, it's not really a holistic view because it doesn't give us any critical thinking about how they're interrelated, nor does it link us up to the processes of policymaking and implementation. We can all do that individually, but as a whole, I think we have to look beyond the SDGs. And I say this because the Anthropocene is also not just about climate change and biodiversity. The slide on shows a container ship that just burned and sank off Sri Lanka last month. Was one of the most devastating environmental impacts of recent years. And yet it's just one event and one ship. The sinking with its toxic chemicals on it and lacing the beaches with plastics. At the same time, we have the most polluted rivers in the world are mostly in Asia. And we have people without access to fresh water. We have temperatures rising because we're building cities, not just because the temperature itself is changing globally. And pollution, air pollution and water pollution are also very much part of the anthropogenic impact we have on the world. If I combine the Anthropocene with planetary urbanization, and Asia's particular interface with that, What we see is a confluence of urbanization along coastal areas, not only in East and Southeast Asia, but also, with few exceptions, in South Asia as well. And these are experiencing increasing environmental disasters. And this study in the middle of this slide shows you which cities, these are the largest cities in the world, and which ones are prepared or not prepared for a flood, a large flood. And it shows you that almost all of these cities that are critically unprepared are in Asia. At the same time, over on the right side, you see that if the ice caps, the polar caps were to melt, all of these cities in the red circles would be underwater, in some cases, entire nations. This is a drastic future that's coming at a very fast and a very impactful rate that we are all experiencing in different ways every day. Interestingly enough, disasters also accelerate migration to cities, even when the city is the center of an episode. For example, the Kathmandu earthquake actually had people coming to Kathmandu to get jobs in construction and so forth. It's not the same for rural areas. The data here shows that also it's becoming more international. And in 2019, there were 25 million people displaced by disasters and about 9 million by conflict. What's happening in many parts of the world, even when it's not registered as such, is many of the disasters of conflict and environment are actually merging together. And that includes Syria, Central America, and many other. Even the Arab Spring had environmental disasters behind it. So what we're going to see is international migration will transcend borders and may even reach hundreds of millions of people in the coming decades. Okay, let's talk about the advent of globopolis, what I call globopolis. And these are the physical layering of globopolis from 1985. 1985 was a very consequential year. It's called Endaka in Japan, where the value of the yen doubled overnight, but it also stimulated a wave of investment coming out of Korea, Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Japan into other places, particularly first Southeast Asia and then East Asia. And projects that were once in the millions became the tens of millions and the hundreds of millions, and now I read the new mega projects are $1 billion or so. They have layered over the cities of East and Southeast Asia and Asia, in fact, in the world in general, with gated housing, new towns, private, simulations of other places, franchises, malls, business hubs, U-towns, and world spectacles like the Olympics that we're seeing right now, and then iconic towers. All of these have displaced, I argue, neighborhoods and public spaces. Saskia Sassen, who is one of the most renowned sociologists in the world today, writes, the spread of megaprojects with vast footprints are eliminating much of the urban tissue, little streets and squares. The capacity to make history is also at stake. The map in the middle shows you these ubiquitous eco-city plans for Korea, and there's so many of them. What they are essentially is eliminate anything that existed before and build a very large city in their place that is wired by internet and other kinds of digital communication. What is interesting about the case of Korea is that in 2028, it's projected that Korean population will start to shrink in number. And most of the provinces in Korea now are already depopulating and still migrating to Seoul. So you have this heady, unrestrained building of vast new cities in a country that has no demand for them, and will be built on places that had farmers, and other kinds of local activities will be totally erased. We also have a plethora of what some people call non-places, replacing places, neighborhoods and so forth. It was quite consternating for me when I lived in Singapore to have to look at a poster saying, imagine your advertisement here. It's just one of the indicators of the commodification of spaces that have no real local place making in them. Some people call it desocialization of space that are listed on the right. So some of you are very much familiar with these smart eco-ubiquitous cities, and here's a list of questions if you are a fan of them to just ask yourself and see what the answers are. Of course, you'll soon find out that these are kind of rhetorical questions. In other words, I don't think they are inclusive. I don't think they provide housing for most people. I don't think they have a genuine impact statements on the environment. And I'm not sure that they stand up to extreme weather events or other manifestations of the Anthropocene, and so on. The last one's very important. Can residents change the built environment? If you buy a place in a house or whatever, can you actually join with your neighbors to create a community center or change the landscape? Here I put in a plug for much of Europe. I'm thinking of Holland, Netherlands in particular, but also Switzerland and other places that don't really build high rises. And they found a way to have very low rise housing with high density housing as an alternative. And there are many benefits to this. I think when you see a city that says we must have built high because we're too crowded, there are other things going on in terms of the politics of development that are shining through that, not really the merit of building tall buildings. So here is my grand scheme. It'll take you quite a while, I'm sure, to get through it, but I'm talking about good governance for resilient cities. It has four main parts: inclusive governance, distributive justice, flourishing planetary biosphere, and social vitality. And the one that's missing in almost all of the presentations I've seen is social vitality, including the SDGs. So I want to focus on that. The civic space is the bedrock of democracy. The spaces where people can meet at arm's distance from government and commercial interests and allow you to organize, to talk and to meet with each other. So let's talk about some of these, in addition to some of these areas that are four areas. In addition to democracy in retreat on a global scale, we find rising disparities of unimagined levels until now, particularly income inequality is out of control in the world. Despite all of the hoopla about economic growth, reducing poverty, in fact, the number of people living in slums in Asia continues to increase. We have gaps or vulnerabilities related to gender, to foreign worker origins, to even aging, which is a huge issue throughout the world, but particularly in higher income countries that I'll talk about in a little bit later. High inequality undermines democracy and meritocracy. These are quotes, these are not my statements, by the way. Government manipulation of the SDGs can only be averted if you have a participatory approach. Let's put super aging into the mix of our consideration about planning for cities. It's really going quite extreme. That's why we get the word super aging. More than 20% of the population over age 65. In the map of Korea on the bottom left, please look at the darker colors. That means that as much as 80% of the population is over age 65. Imagine the life in those areas. There are no children, the schools have closed, and you're dealing with a generation, 2 or 3 generations that will be 50 years old or older in those places. So we give too much attention to the capital cities and the burgeoning metropolis of Asia, but not to the rest of the country, which is experiencing rapid aging. At the same time, that's having part of an impact of what people are calling the demographic winter, in which we have negative population growth rates in many parts of the world, but not only Europe, but also East Asia, Japan, Korea, and now China, because of its one-child policy. So you see in Japan, in the bottom right map, only one place is actually in the color of increasing population. The rest of the country is shrinking. This has a tremendous impact on economic potential and other aspects of welfare as we talk about SDGs. Okay, I spend a minute on capabilities and conviviality, the civic space aspect of it, because it's the hardest one to convince people of when they think only materially, that only economic growth and basically basic income really measure what well-being is. So I point you to your further research, if you'd like. If you haven't done this already, look up Martha Nussbaum's idea of human capability, of being truly human. To look up the idea of conviviality, which is really very well written about in the literature. It argues the point that creative activities, sense of community count for at least as much and maybe more than material standards of living. Okay, that's a big one to take on. I think it's true, but it's hard to get into. Just one case, a slum burns down in Taipei maybe 10 years ago, and the people who were living there were resettled. They had been taking care of each other. When they resettled, they began to die because the neighbor who helped them wasn't there anymore. That kind of relationship is not really being addressed in what we're consider SDGs and other kinds of considerations. And now let's get to the environment. I think we really have to get rid of this UN Sustainable Development Brundtland Report kind of graphic in which it shows the economy is as big as the environment and is also autonomous from it. And then it kind of disingenuously says people will get needs, but actually what the market does is get you wants. It doesn't really talk to the idea of needs. And it doesn't have any regard for the environment except what humans can take from it. So we have that embedded in that, and you see the picture of the palm oil, which is really the scourge of Southeast Asia now is palm oil plantations. There's no way to care about that as long as we can still take things from the environment. So we need to think more as the human life embedded in nature. We are part of nature and the economy is smaller than us. And if we start to understand that, we can start to rethink about how we talk about indicators of the good society. Okay, I'm going to give an example of Jakarta, but it could be other places of how this plays out as Globopolis comes in and the response to it. Jakarta is the fastest sinking city in the world, according to at least the newspapers. And that's a result of deforestation, of depleting the aquifers, building houses and tarmac over the cityscape, and then putting about 30 million people in the greater Jakarta area called Jabodetabek. There was an attempt in the late 1970s that is shown actually in the environmental zoning of planning with nature in which certain zones were not supposed to be built in. And that fell to the wayside in the new era of mega projects from the mid-1980s when all manner of new towns were being built and shopping malls at a very heady pace. In addition, the very place in the city region that should have been, we would worry about, is actually filling up with large condos. And so the city sinks. And what's the answer to that? Let's build more cement polders in the bay. On the lower left, we will demolish the slums, so-called slums, and put cement in the way. And then instead of having people with given water through piped water. Now they're just taking it out of the ground. We're going to move the capital city to East Kalimantan, in a place where nobody resides. This is the solution. Meanwhile, in Jakarta, you have people along the Ciliwung River who've organized themselves and tried to improve the resilience, but the government does not listen to them and instead just raises their houses. In Japan, we find that after the Tohoku events in late 2011, they're building a 40-foot high wall along the entire coast instead of dealing with other issues. Meanwhile, people are warehoused 10 years later in temporary housing. So here's what we need to do. We need to recapture areas of the city for neighborhoods. We need to have people, places where people can meet people on a daily basis, can help each other out, can find out who they are as human beings through human relationships. We see all kinds of activities throughout the world to actually recapture streets and other places for neighborhood experiences. We also need to think about new forms of housing. Even the nuclear family is disappearing. In many big cities in the world, 25% or more of the houses have only one person in them. So we see these experiments in co-living and seniors living with younger people in a very proactive way that I think are very much worth looking at. One of the most impressive of the people building cities approaches is the Bangkok Ban Mangkong project that's covered the whole nation. And it turns out that these places that were basically rebuilt from slums by the people who reside in them through small government loans and NGO networks were most able to resist the Bangkok flood and even assist other areas. A small town in southern Thailand, so we're talking about a city of less than 20,000 people, also went in total recycling with a very dynamic mayor replanting the mangroves, and really recovering the economy in a culturally, environmentally sound way. So it's possible. The most, I think, inspiring episode is in Seoul, Korea, that went from a city that was under siege 24 hours a day and into a city that is really convivial. And in 2 years, the mayor of Seoul was able to reduce energy consumption by the equivalent of one nuclear power plant through cooperative relationship with citizens. So lastly, I want to talk about planning with nature. And Ian McHarg is the person who put out the book Design with Nature. I think some of you know about it, but it faded into the background while a kind of a superficial approach to compact cities, which really has, it's a very complicated idea and is not so straightforward as it might seem, took precedence over planning with cities. So now there's a worldwide interest in talking about planning with nature or designing with nature that includes consideration of the flora, the fauna, the type of land uses and land capabilities of making riverbeds deeper and wider so that the flood can find its way out into broader ocean or other areas. And this is really catching on in many places, and I'm sure you know more about it than I do, but it deserves a great deal of attention. Here's an interesting case on the left and the right bottom, in which certain parts of the city are prepared for very high levels of flooding, and in other words, it would be inundated, while some parts of the city would receive more attention to be protected from that kind of extreme flooding. In a sign of this approach, the country of the Netherlands has decided to build no more polders and is going to redesign its landscape to actually accommodate extreme weather events rather than try to fortify and build walls. Lastly, I think one of the most exciting ideas that goes beyond the city, but it starts in cities and moves outwards, is rewilding. Rewilding probably began with talking about more peripheral areas and having wildlife recover, but this is an approach that is engaging all of Europe into refiguring how landscapes can be redesigned to accommodate a rewilding of nature itself. And they have indicators or index of the ecological integrity of cities, which I think would be very, very a good idea for us all to think about how we would measure our city in terms of ecological integrity. And you can find all of this online through Rewilding Europe. So you see the map on the left, in which shows very urbanized areas, very, very low level of integrity. But there's a way in which we can focus on the built environment to better accommodate the vagaries of the Anthropocene while moving outward and letting farther away places actually regenerate themselves. I would appreciate any discussion on this kind of concept, which goes beyond the city and talks about continental and even global ways of living with nature.